All right, welcome to week 15. We are studying in the Americas and Africa this week. Really talking about the colonies and the different social structures, and we're going to be talking about the African slave trade. So here we go. Now, the Spanish Caribbean is going to be starting with the Taino people, or T people from here on out. Columbus is going to land on Hispaniola, and this is going to be the base of trade for the tea people. Once Christopher Columbus gets there, he's disappointed that there's no silk, no spices, and because of that, he gets a little bit frustrated. However, he's then going to see that there's some other resources. He's going to recruit the tea people, mostly by force, to work in the mines for him. Eventually, he's just going to force them to work, and this is the basis of the comida, or the forced labor system. Now, from mining, we're going to move to a plantation style. Now, the tea people are going to rebel. They're going to fight back. However, the Spanish have guns and smallpox, which is a massive tool they have, and eventually are going to be subdued. Now, the tea people are going to disappear eventually, so the Spanish are going to get desperate and are going to need to find other people in order to work in the mines. With that being said, they start conquering more territory in order to find more people to work. Now, with the limited gold production and silver production, they're going to have to find a new source of income, and the source of income is going to be the sugarcane. Once sugarcane comes on the map, the importation of slaves goes up dramatically. Now, the Spanish conquistadors are going to be the conquering Spaniards who come in to the New World and start conquering territories. Well, the most famous one is Hernan Cortez. He's going to take down the Aztecs in Mexico. He's going to come in, conquer, destroy. He's going to be treated as a god, but then eventually kill and destroy. Now, the Aztecs are going to put up three major battles. First battle, the Spanish win. Second battle, the Aztecs almost win. And third one, the Spanish completely destroy any opposition. Once after that third battle, the Spanish have complete control, and they actually end up calling Mexico New Spain because they have completely controlled and decimated any people who push against. Now, Francisco Pizarro is going to go down into South America and conquer the Incans along the Peru and the Andes Mountains. Very successful, and he is now going to claim that northern part of South America for Mexico, for Spain, that is. Now, when we have these new Spanish colonies, we're going to have this administrative system, and the base is going to be in Mexico, where most of the Aztec gold and goods are coming from. We're also going to have viceroys, who are going to be essentially like the English governors, who work on the will of the king, who are going to be there to set up order and set up local power and organize the people in a much more effective way. There's going to be considerable dispute with Spanish homeland over the ways to spend the money, ways to use the money, the gold. However, we're going to see that the Spanish crown is going to win. Now, Portugal is going to be conquering territories as well. They're going to conquer a territory called Brazil. The reason why this is the only place they conquer is because the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas is going to divide the world between Spain and Portugal to keep them from fighting with one another. Portugal is going to claim Brazil, which is right on the dividing line. However, once they first take over Brazil, they have little interest in it until they realize, oh, they can exploit this for the new cash crop of sugarcane. Now, settler colonies in North America, they're going to have Spanish towns, forts, missions, all the way around the North America, and some even on the West Coast. We're also going to start seeing a couple more permanent civilizations from France, from England, the Netherlands. France is going to start in Canada, and then essentially lead into central United States. England is going to start settling up around the coastline of New England, specifically Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, when we talk about colonial governments, they are very difficult. It is not fun to be a colonist. No one is ever jealous of a colonist because starvation is very, very prevalent. Cannibalism occasionally practices. If you don't die from disease and starvation, you're probably going to be killed by your neighbor. If you aren't killed by your neighbor, you're probably going to be killed during childbirth. But if you give birth to a child, your child's probably going to die anyway. It's not a great place to be. Now, the French and the English are going to have private merchants are going to invest in colonies. They're going to set up colonies. A perfect example is Jamestown, where they're trying to create money. And Jamestown was settled in order to mine gold. Now, we know that there is no gold in Virginia, and Jamestown essentially fails for quite some time. We all know Pocahontas and all that stuff. She saves them, and that's great. And we're going to see that it eventually becomes an agricultural place, and eventually they discover the cash crop of tobacco. Now, the greater levels of self-government are going to be found in France and English. We're going to see a lot more democratic, a lot more local governments than in the Spanish. The Spanish are going to import their leaders, while the French and the English are going to use local leaders to a degree. Now, European empires and colonies, this is your map that you did. You should be pretty familiar with it, that it does vary. Now, the relations with the indigenous people vary from different types of backgrounds. Now, the North American peoples are very loosely organized and migratory, which means they only have tribal ties to their immediate group. They don't feel any sort of allegiance to one another. With that being said, they will not work with one another. Their conflicts with one another don't allow them to align against the English because they are so separate. Some of them are signing allegiances with the British, some of them are not. Now, unlike the Aztecs and the Incans, who are very, very unified, even though they couldn't beat the Spanish because of the gunpowder as well. Now, European colonists stake out forested land, clear it for agriculture. This is obviously going to be in great opposition to what the natives are going to be doing. We're also going to have so many Europeans that are essentially just going to overwhelm the natives. Now, the conflict with the indigenous people are going to come from feeling of trespassing on hunting grounds and displacement of the indigenous people. I mean, they feel like this is their land, that these white people are coming in and stealing, and essentially they are. Now, the English settlers negotiate treaties poorly understood by natives, and they kind of just take advantage, complete advantage of the fact that they know that they can defeat them with guns. Now, the military conflict is frequent. You're going to have a lot of Indian raids on colonists. You're going to have a lot of colonists doing Indian raids on the natives, and it's just a really terrible thing. Now, once there starts colonization in the Americas, we're going to see that the American population is going to plummet significantly. As the higher the European population gets, the lower the native and the lower the Africans, and that's because the Europeans are killing out most people by war, conflict, or smallpox, which is going to wipe out a lot. Now, the formation of multicultural societies is going to occur the moment white people start showing up on the shores. Now, the European and the African immigrants are primarily men, so what they need is women. Now, what we're going to see, men, no matter if they're cultural background is not mixed, they will mate with the local women, and that happened everywhere. Specifically Spain, specifically the English. The French are a little bit more independent, and they're going to blend they're going to become even more dependent on one another. Now, the Spanish, the Mestizo, or the Mixed Societies Forum, people of Spanish and native parentage, descendants of Spaniards and African slaves and mulattoes, and descendants of African slaves and natives are Zambos. Okay, we're going to see that this is very common in the Caribbean and Mexico, but it's not very common in Peru. Now, social hierarchy, it's going to be race-based. The Spanish are going to have the highest and most regimented social structure of all of the colonies. Now, the top are the Peninsulars, or migrants from the Iberian Peninsula, or Spain. So anyone who's coming from Europe are going to be the most important, the most socially influential. Now, the Creoles are the children of immigrants. So if your parents came here and you were born here, you're a Creole, you're the second layer. If you're a Mezzetto, a mulatto, or a Zambo, or other combinations of parentage, you're in that third tier, and the very fourth tier is your slaves and your conquered people. Now, a major defining factor in social standing is your sexual hierarchy. So, depending on if you're male, female, depending on your parental range is going to have a huge impact. Now, in Northern America, which is not where we're going to have that many Spanish, we're going to have a higher ratio of French and English female migrants than in South America. So the French and the English are going to bring over a lot more women. Now, keep in mind, the Spanish are there to make money, gold, silver, and sugar. Now, the French are coming over here for fur pellets, which is going to be their major export. And the English are coming over here to set up permanent colonies where they're going to focus on cotton and they're going to focus on, to start, tobacco. So because they're trying to set up more permanent colonies rather than major cash crop plantations, they're going to bring over women. So because they have more women, you're going to see a lot more withdrawn from the natives. Now, there's going to be a higher social stigma attached to relationship with natives and African slaves. So if you are a Frenchie or a British and you do have a relationship, it's going to have a lot more stigma. Fur traders have a relationship with North American native women. These are going to be primarily French, and their children are called métis. So they're going to be seen as a lot more equal in the French society than in the British. Now, mining in the Spanish Empire, going back down, the hunt is for gold and silver. Conquistadors are going to destroy the Aztec Incan treasures and melt them down for value, or raw precious metal. So that's why we don't have a ton of information in relics, because the Spanish destroyed them. Now, the gold is not extensive in Spanish holdings, but silver is relatively plentiful. So there's not a ton of gold, but there's a ton of silver. Extensive employment of natives. Now, when we think about it, when we say employment, their working conditions really aren't that great. Let's just keep that in mind. The Inca Mita system of conscripted laborers are going to be used and exploited. The dangerous working conditions are going to wipe out a ton of people as well. And eventually, they're going to force the people to assimilate into the Spanish culture. With this forced regimental social structure that we're going to see, and a lot of different other components, especially with the language, the requirement of them to learn Spanish, and all those different requirements. Now, the fifth reserve for crown or quinto are hugely profitable. These are going to be very, very specific mines. Now, the global significance of the silver, it's a major resource and income for the Spanish crown. They're going to base their entire economy. The Manila galleons take it from the Pacific Rim for trading. It's going to start spreading all around the world. Now, it's very, very, very popular in Chinese markets, but it's also traded in the Atlantic basin. Now, the La Hacienda is large estates that produce products of European origin, like wheat, grapes, and meat. They are going to be set up in the Americas. They're going to sell them to other Native Americans and to other local Europeans. Now, the Inca media system of utilizing native labor is going to be used here. It's going to have plenty of abuses, especially between 1520 and 1540, where it was not regulated that much. Gradually is going to be replaced by a debt peonage, which is going to be essentially, it's going to be where people, you can buy, people pay for you to travel all the way over here, and eventually they'll let you free, or indentured servitude. Peasants repay loans with cheap labor. Now, here's what they look like. Here's one in Chile. They are very, very profitable because of the high desire for European goods, especially amongst the immigrants or the local descendants of Europeans. Now, the resistance to Spanish rule is going to become pretty intense because the Spanish are incredibly harsh on the natives. We're going to have a rebellion in 1680 called the Pueblo Revolt. We're going to have 1780, the Tupac Amaru Rebellion, and they're going to be very sizable rebellions. However, they're going to be put down. Some of the ways that aren't as violent are going to be half-hearted work, retreat into mountains and forests, so the people of these areas are going to run off into the remote areas, and they're going to try to appeal to the Spanish crown and explain, hi, we'll be more than happy, just treat us fairly, please help us, all those. Now, sugar and slavery in Portugal and Brazil is going to go hand in hand. Now, the sugar mill, it refers to a complex land, labor, etc., and all is it all based on the production of sugar. Now, what happens is we have to take the sugar cane and we turn it to molasses or to refined sugar for export. So you have to take the sugar cane, you have to grind it down in order to get the molasses or to refine the sugar. It has very low profit margins. It takes a lot of sugar in order to make a large profit. However, it is easier to have a sugar plantation than it is to have a silver mine. Now, unlike the Spanish system of forced labor, Portuguese relied on imported African slaves. They didn't even try to force the locals, they just brought their own slaves. Now, the large-scale importing of slaves begins in the 1580s. Working conditions were poor. About 5 to 10% die annually. Approximately 1 human life per ton of sugar is what it's going to cost. So we start seeing a huge toll on human life already. Now, fur trading in North America is when the indigenous peoples trade pelts for wool blankets, iron pots, firearms, and alcohol. So the French are going into, mostly the French, I mean we do have some British, but it's going to be mostly be French who go into the internal parts of the United States, well, the now known as the United States, and trade with the Indians and the Indians are interested in European goods like the guns most specifically. Now, beaver hunts cause frequent incursions to neighboring territories and conflicts. We're going to have a lot of conflicts due to pelt wars where people are competing in order to get more European goods, specifically guns. And this is going to cause a lot of problems between the natives and the Europeans. Now, eventually, European settler cultivators also are going to displace the natives on traditional lands because Europeans are spreading out, because Europeans are becoming more and more familiar with the territory that they're going to find these pelts. We're going to see that they are going to be spreading out throughout the continent a whole lot more. Now, originally, we're going to see that the Native Americans, like in Plymouth, like in Jamestown, the natives are going to be a great assistance. But as time passes, we're going to see that they are going to become less welcomed. Now, the development of cash crops are going to create a need in Europe. So the more cash crops they have, the higher the need in Europe, the higher the need, the more cash crops we need. So products developed for European markets specifically are tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton. Now keep in mind, indigo is that pretty blue color, and beforehand we didn't really have any dyes that would do it. Indigo is a cheap, very plentiful flower in the United States. So we're going to see that it is a great cash crop and a huge benefit. Now, we are also going to see that increased demand in imported slave labor here in the United States and here in South America due to these cash crops. Now, keep in mind, these cash crops are based on the idea that we are trying to make as much money as possible. They don't really care about human plight. So it's about making money ASAP. With that being said, it's easier to buy someone once and use all their children in labor for free. So, increases demand on imported slave labor. European indentured servants are going to become very popular for the English side, specifically 4 to 7 year terms. However, chronically unemployed, orphans, political prisoners, and criminals are the ones who are going to be the most interested in this. Because if you're a wealthy, good citizen in Europe, why would you leave the comfort of Europe to be a colonist? So the people who are coming over here, especially through this indentured servant program, are not particularly good people. So, yeah, not the kind of people you'd want working for you. Now, as we're going to see that tobacco becomes one of the largest cash crops for Europe. Specifically comes out of Virginia, and Virginia is still the world's largest exporter of it, and it's going to increase significantly and very quickly. Now, slavery in North America is going to become more and more prevalent with the cash crop of cotton. Now, African slaves are going to be in Virginia in 1619. It was kind of by accident. The first slaves were actually sold. A Dutch ship was stranded and was blown off course, and they needed resources, they needed food, they needed shelter, so they sold some of their Africans in order for the exchange, and ta-da, first slaves. Now, increasingly, these slaves begin to replace the European indentured servitude because The indentured servants weren't of good quality, and they were terrible workers who weren't ready to work, who weren't dedicated to their work, and would run off. So the slaves couldn't run off, so they kept buying them. It was a better bang for your buck. Now, the less prominent in the north due to weak nature of the cash crop industry. Up north, Virginia is really about as high as we go for cash crops. Up north, it's mostly about sustenance. It's also about trees and lumbering. It's a huge exporter of lumber, which isn't really as hands-on and physically stressful as, sugarcane and cotton. So because of that, essentially that did not become a slave-based economy. Now, products made through slave labor are going to be rum, which are going to be based on sugar, and it's going to become an important part of the economy. Now, there's 3 reasons why the Europeans went to the Americas: God, gold, glory. God is a huge part. Now, the Franciscan, the Dominican, and Jesuit missionaries are trying to spread Catholicism. Remember, the Protestant Reformation is going to take a lot of people away from the Catholic Church, so they're trying to essentially turn people back to the Catholic Church. And the best way to do it is essentially get the natives. Now, they taught Christian doctrine and literacy. They often accumulated cultural knowledge to better communicate their message. So they're going to start recording and using cultural things in order to push their message of Catholicism. They're going to, due to conquest and plague, many of the natives in Spanish America conclude gods had abandoned them and converted to Catholicism. So they truly believed, especially in the Aztecs, that their Aztecs god rejected them. And because he rejected them and didn't protect them, that the only god possibly left is the Americans. Now, one of the most famous symbols from the Spanish Christians and then local converts is the Virgin of Guadalupe. If you've ever been to Spain, they have a very interesting, if you've ever been to Mexico, I'm sorry, the Spanish influence of Christianity there is very, very unique, very gaudy, very playful with the idea of Jesus and Mary and all these different components. And the Virgin of Guadalupe is a perfect example of that. Now, the French and the English missionaries are going to be less effective than the Spanish missions. The reason is because the Spaniards ruled native populations more directly. They were hands-on, completely involved in everybody's business. The English and the French are way more hands-off. Now, the migration patterns of North American natives made it also more difficult to turn them into Christians because they kept moving around on a regular basis. Now, English colonists had little interest in converting natives. They really just wanted them to go away. So we're not going to see. The French are going to do a little bit of effort, but it's the Spanish who really push for it. Now, the Australia and the larger world, what happens is they're going to have similar experiences to the natives. What's going to happen is that people are going to really push for conquering of territories in order to set up cash crops. The natives are going to be wiped out by disease and all those types of things. The Portuguese mariners have been in the region for a while, but the Dutch sailors make the first recorded sighting of Australia in 606. The VOC, which is the Dutch trading company, surveys territory and conclude it has very little value. However, later on we're going to see with Captain James Cook, he is going to set up a study there, and he's going to start sending convicts to Australia and eventually outnumber the free settlers until about 1830. So what's going to happen is more convicts are being sent to Australia than people who are wanting to go to Australia. Okay, so what other things are going on in the Pacific Islands? The Manila galleons are interested in quick trade routes, little exploration of Pacific. People are just trying to get to where they need to go. They're not really trying to settle up islands. However, the islands of Guam and the Marianas are significant because they lay on trade routes. We're going to see a lot more interaction here and a lot more cultural diffusion. In the 1670s, 1680s, they took control of the islands. Smallpox destroys local population, and they essentially become colonies because everyone else is dead. Now, James Cook is going to visit Hawaii in 1778. He has a good relationship with the Hawaiians. His sailors are going to spread venereal diseases, also known as STDs, and he's not really welcomed in 1779, and eventually he's going to be killed over a dispute over petty thieves. He also made a comment about one of the chief's wives, so yeah, not really the classiest guy to hang out with. So now we're on to Africa. Now Africa is going to have some cities, African states. We're going to see that they are going to rise and fall in power. However, these states are going to be directly influenced by the slave trade. So let's get to it. Now, the states of West Africa and East Africa, they're going to develop over 8th to 16th centuries. Now, the Kingdom of Ghana is not related to the modern state of Ghana. It is a major gold trader. It has a ton of natural resources of gold, and it's going to be known for its gold sources. Now, the Malay Empire is going to be during the 13th century, which we've talked about. And then we have the Songhay. So it goes from Kingdom of Ghana to the Malay to now the Songhay Empire, which is in the 15th century. Now, Sunni Ali is going to be one of the most effective of their leaders, and he is going to create an effective army and navy. He's also going to have musket-bearing he's also going to build up their empire to be a very powerful force. However, a musket-bearing Moroccan army, which are going to be supported by the Portuguese, are going to destroy the Songhay forces because the Africans didn't have guns, and because of the Portuguese, the Moroccans did. And ta-da, we're going to see that city-states are going to exert local control. Now, the Swahili decline is going to occur in East Africa. Now, Portuguese Vasco da Gama skirmishes with the Africans on the East Coast. We're also going to see in 1502, Kilwa are required to pay tribute. And by 1505, Portuguese gunships dominate Swahili ports. So the cultural diversity of the Swahili tribes are going to be limited because the Portuguese are just going to take over it. They're going to follow the path of Vasco da Gama, and once they follow that path, they're going to start claiming ports. And once those ports are claimed, they essentially diminish the local languages and the local powers. Now, the Kingdom of Kongo is going to pop up. They are going to create a relationship with the Portuguese beginning in 1483. Their first king is King Nzinga. Will be later known as Alfonso I, and he is going to convert to Roman Catholicism in order to get good favor with the Portuguese. He is very helpful to the Portuguese, which is the reason why he stays around for so long. He shows the Portuguese how to get the resources they want, how to defeat his enemies, all these types of things. However, we're going to see that's going to lead to his demise because the Europeans don't really take him seriously, and they're just going to kill him off anyway. When he does convert King Nzinga to Roman Catholicism, he forces all of his people to convert. It doesn't really go well. Just because of how intense he is, but it is going to be a major cultural change, essentially. Now, what we are going to see is that the Portuguese are going to know that their major colony, which is really the only real successful colony at this point, is Brazil, and it requires a large slave labor in order to keep it going. Now, initially, Portuguese attempts at slave raidings are not very successful. Essentially, they're sending white people into the central part of Africa, and once they see them, they essentially run off or kind of kill them. What they end up doing, it's just easier to trade weapons for slaves provided by African traders. So essentially, they're paying Africans to go get African slaves to be exported to other territories. So they're paying Africans for Africans to sell. Now, the Congo kings appeal without success to slow but not eliminate the slave trade. The African kings know this is really not a good thing and that no one is really taking them seriously. They try to slow it down, but they can't because cash crops, colonies in the Americas need slave trade in order to function on a huge scale. We're going to see that it cannot be slowed down. Now, relationships begin to deteriorate with the Portuguese because of their lack of slowing down slave importation. So the Portuguese just straight up attack Congo and decapitate the poor king in 1665 just because he just wasn't helping anymore. And if he's not helping, he might as well be dead. However, with his death, it did improve the slave market. So that's good. Um, so it was easier to get trades once they decapitated the king. So that's pretty successful. Now the Kingdom of Ndongo and Angola, he's going to gain wealth and independence from the Congo by means of the Portuguese slave trade. Okay, they are going to be kind of pushing back on her and the Kingdom of Kongo. Now, the Portuguese are going to try to influence this very powerful kingdom, and it's going to be resisted by Queen Nzinga. Now, Queen Nzinga is going to pose as a male king, which is pretty cool, with male concubines in female dress attending her in order to create an alliance with the Portuguese in order to save face. However, with this temporary alliance with the Dutch, its unsuccessful ability to repel the Portuguese. Essentially, all of the Africans want the Portuguese gone because the Portuguese are the ones really taking the most people out of Africa. Now, the decline of the Ndongo power declines after Nzinga's death. We're also going to see some regional kingdoms in South Africa. Now, the chieftains developed the Swahili city-states. By 1300, we have Great Zimbabwe. The Dutch build Cape Town in 1652 to increase the involvement of Southern African politics. Remember, they're trying to increase their influence while everyone in Africa wants less influence of the Portuguese. The British colonies are also going to continue to develop around the world, and it's going to just continue to increase slave demand. Now, Islam in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa is going to also increase. With the pre-Islamic paganism and ancestor worship, Islam is going to kind of pull into there with all the shamanism. Now, Islam is going to develop in commercial centers first because obviously the major traders of this time and throughout the world are going to be Muslims. Now, Timbuktu becomes the major center of Islamic scholarship by the 16th century. It is the place to be in Africa for education, for enlightenment, for Islam, the whole thing. Now, African traditions and beliefs blend into Islam. They make it their own. They just don't accept it. They kind of blend into it. And we start seeing gender relations and standards of female modesty are going to come more into place where women are now covered because of it, and it has a huge influence. Now, keep in mind that Islam is going to be a very powerful force in the western side of Africa, and the eastern side, central, is going to be more, east central side is going to be more Christian. Now, the Fulani are going to create a movement to impose strict adherence to Islamic norms in Africa. It's a movement of Islamic thought. In 1680, it begins military campaigns to enforce the Sharia, which is the law codes of Islam, in West Africa. So they're trying to reconquer this territory and make sure everyone is following the Islamic law codes. It has considerable influence and does extend to the south as well, but it's not all inclusive. Not everything has been super heavily influenced. Now, Christianity is still going to be in Sub-Saharan Africa, even though Islam is going to become more popular. They are going to blend it with traditional African beliefs, which makes it unique. Now, the Anatolian movement is going to flourish in the 18th century. It's about having a black Jesus, essentially. Jesus is a black man, Congo, the Holy Land, and the heavens for Africans. So it's founded by Donna Beatrice, claiming the possession of St. Anthony of Padua, insight into the fact that it was truly a black Jesus. And essentially, Christian missionaries persuade King Pedro IV of Congo to burn her at the stake for all of the terrible things she was saying against the church. Now, as we see, social changes are going to create a huge change in early modern Africa. Now, trade with the Europeans are going to bring new goods to Africa. They're going to bring guns. They're going to bring rum. They're also going to bring a lot of conflict as well. Now, new crops from the Americas. Manioc is going to become a staple bread flour. It's essentially a really kind of grainy plant, which is going to have a take off in Africa, and it's going to be the leading food source for a lot of Africans still to this day. It's going to increase food supply, boost population growth despite slave trade. So because of these new types of food crops, food is going to increase even though we're exporting millions of slaves. Now, the population growth in Africa is going to become very, very large and grow very quickly because of these new food sources. Now, the foundations of the slave trade are based on war captives. Now, African slavery has been around since the dawn of time, essentially, and it's typically used to be war captives, criminals, and people expelled from clans. Now, we're going to see that it's distinct from Asian or European slaves because they have no private property, therefore wealth is defined by human labor potential, not land. What we're going to see, the slaves assimilate into owner's clan. So the foundation of the slave trade is that because you have no property, you can be owned. Now, the Islamic slave trade is a dramatic expansion of the slave trade of the Arab traders. Remember, the Muslims are using slaves in the Indian Ocean basin. Now, these new slaves are going to be acquired by raiding villages and selling on Swahili coast. So they're going to be raiding to a degree. They're going to be the largest slave purchasers, the Muslims, for a very long time until the colonies start setting up in America, and it will be the most exported slaves will go there. Now, the Arab traders depended on African infrastructure to maintain supplies. So what that means is that they depended on the clans conflicting, the groups, the rivalries, the separation, the lack of unity in order to continue their supply. Now, Europeans' demand on the West Coast causes the demand to rise again. Because of the colonies, it's easier to get a colony it's easier to pick up slaves on the West Coast than it is on the East Coast. Now, the Arab slave traders, what we're going to see, they are absolutely terrible. And we're going to see that both the Portuguese and the Arabs are all terrible to one another. Now, the early slave trade is going to be that the Portuguese are going to raid West African coast in 1441 for the first time and take 12 men. This is going to be met with huge resistance. However, they're going to find out that they can just pay African dealers to provide the slaves for them. It's more cost effective, it's cheaper, and easier. By 1460, 500 slaves per year were being sold to miners, porters, domestic servants in Spain, and in Portugal. So this becomes the chosen way to do it. Pay someone to go get the slaves, and then you pay for the slaves. By 1520, 2,000 slaves a year were being put to work on sugarcane plantations, just sugarcane plantations. Now, the triangular trade is going to be based in the Atlantic slave trade. European manufactured goods, especially firearms, are sent to Africa. Rum, guns are going to leave from Europe and head to Africa. They're going to sell the rum, the guns, to the Africans in exchange for slaves. Now, the slaves would then board the ships and go across the Middle Passage. Now, the Middle Passage is the ocean crossing from Africa to the New World. Once the African slaves were purchased, they were then sent to the Americans, sent to the Americas through the Middle Passage, and then they were sold to plantations in order to grow cash crops, which are purchased in Americas. And once they are in America, Americans are buying these slaves with cash crops like molasses, like sugarcane, like cotton, and then those goods are going back to Europe, which they'll be used in production. And then the Europeans will go back down to Africa and they will sell those rum and guns to the Africans, and the whole process starts all over. You should know this map because you did this map. Now, the Middle Passage, as I was describing earlier, is when the African slaves are captured by raiding parties and are sold to the Portuguese or the Dutch. Then they're sent to the Americas and they are in a tiny, tiny ship. Now, the Middle Passage went from 4 to 6 weeks And the mortality rate is incredibly high. Over 50% are going to die on the way. Eventually, they are going to cut their losses, and only about 5%. They're going to keep them alive just enough that they make it, and not that many people are going to die the later on into the slave trade. Now, the total slave traffic from the 15th to the 18th century is about 12 million people. However, about 4 million of those people are going to die before they even hit the shores. Okay, we're going to see that the slave export is going to jump up significantly in the 18th century. Now, impact on African regions. Obviously, when we're taking 12 million Africans out of their country, out of their continent, it's obviously going to have an effect. Rwanda, Buganda, Masini, and Turkana resist slave trade, and they defend their borders. We're going to see that they have the larger population. The reason why they are successful in keeping the slave traders out is because the distance from slave ports on the western coast. They're much further north. Other societies benefit from the slave trade, the Asante, the Dahomey, and the Oyo. They're going to be your leaders of slave traders. So they're going to be the ones going in and pulling out the slaves. Now, the effects, the long-term ones, the total African population expands due to importation of American crops. So we have more Africans than we've ever had, yet millions of captured Africans were removed from society, depleted regional populations. We're going to see that the slave trade is going to favor certain territories, and they're going to use and conquer as many people as they can from that territory before they move on to another. So we're just going to have one area targeted. We're going to deplete a large part of the population. Then they move on to another territory, and they suck up the whole population there. We're going to have distorted sex ratios. About 2/3 of slaves are male, between the age of 14 to 35 years in age. And this is going to cause a lot of problems in Africa. It encouraged polygamy, and women acting in traditionally male roles, and this is going to cause a lot of conflict in Africa because of the unpredictability of who was going, who was staying, who was going to be here, who was not. Now, the political effects, they are going to introduce firearms and increase violence of pre-existing conflicts. So once the guns come into play, already previous conflicts are only going to get worse. Now, the more firearms, the more slaves, more weapons. The more slaves, more weapons, more conflicts, the more slaves you get. Now, Dahomey people created an army dedicated to the slave trade, about enforcing it and keeping it working. Now, the African slaves in plantation societies, they're going to be located in the tropical or subtropical regions. Now, the first time through the Middle Passage, they're going to head straight to the Caribbean. The Caribbean is going to have the highest need for slaves because sugarcane farming is going to be incredibly, overwhelmingly tough labor, and silver mining, which is also going down in the Caribbean. So, the first plantation established in Hispaniola in 1516. Later on, the Mexico, British, Caribbean, and the Americas are going to have plantations all over the place. The major cash crop is going to be sugar. Later, tobacco, rice, indigo, cotton, and coffee are going to become major cash crops, which will need slave labor as well. We're going to see that the importation of African slaves is going to create racial divisions of labor, that only Africans work in the fields, not white people. So we're going to see that distinction is going to start showing up. As you can see from this chart, most of these people are going to be heading to the Caribbean. Like I said, sugarcane plantations are some of the hardest work. You're going to see Brazil, which is more sugarcanes. You're going to see only about 12% make it to Central and South America, where we're going to see the silver mines, and only about 5% make it to North America. Keep in mind, the slave traders are going to the Caribbean first, then going to Brazil, then going to North America. So by the time slaves are reaching North America, they're going to be the weakest, least desirable of the shipment. Now, the regional differences, the Caribbean to South America, although Africans are unable to maintain numbers through natural means due to malaria, yellow fever, brutal working conditions. I mean, these slaves are getting killed off every single day. Poor nutrition, poor sanitation, and a complete gender imbalance. We're going to see the need for constant importation of slaves because sugar plantations are so hard work. we're going to see that Africans, they have to keep importing them because they're not reproducing. In North America, there's a lot less disease and more normal sex ratio. So almost 50-50 men to women. We're going to start seeing the slave families are going to be encouraged as prices rise in the 18th century. Why buy people new slaves every year when you can force them to mate and they make babies for free? And that's going to be a huge trend here in North America. Now, the resistance to slavery is going to be pretty intense in some parts. Half-hearted work effort is going to be accomplished by the slaves. Sabotage, they're going to try to mess up the plantations, burn them down. They're going to flight. They're going to have maroon populations, which means they're going to create their own little societies separated from the colonized territories, and they're going to have revolts. Now, slave revolts are going to be very not common, but only one has been really actually successful. Now, the French are going to control Santo Domingo in 1793. It is the only successful place to be overthrown that was a majority of slaves. It's going to be renamed Haiti once the revolt is successful. However, otherwheres, revolts outgunned by European American firepower, they were put down very, very harshly. We're going to see that Jamaica is actually going to be another successful island that is going to lead and have a slave revolt and be successful at it. But that's a little later on. Now, African American culture, the diversity of African cultures concentrated in slave populations because of the blending of all these different cultural backgrounds, because these people are just being picked up and just shoved together. We're going to see the African languages when numbers permit. Otherwise, European language adapted with African influences. So a Creole language is going to be created because of the blending of all these different languages. Christianity is going to be adapted to incorporate African traditions and used to help express a lot of the frustration, and are used to kind of challenge the slave authority as well. Now, the abolition of slavery is going to come with Equano, who is a former slave and best-selling author of his autobiography. He does a very eloquent argument against the institution of slavery, and that becomes very, very influential around, especially for the Dutch and especially for the Portuguese. It's the same kind of thing that happened with Uncle Tom's Cabin here in the United States during right before the Civil War. It's such a well-written book that really demonstrates the horrors of slavery. It persuades the population. So this is what he does. Equano does this for the first time for the Portuguese and the Dutch. Now, economic costs of slavery are going to increase. Okay? People are going to revolt. You have to pay to keep those revolts down. Military expenses are incredibly high. By the 18th century, the price of sugar falls, the price of slave raises. So we're going to see it's going to cause an unfair balance, and it's going to cost a lot more money. Wage labor becomes more efficient. We're going to see that people are willing to work for a salary. Wage earners can spend income on manufactured goods. So we're going to see that's going to become the topic of choice. Eventually, the slave trade is going to end. Denmark is going to abolish slave trade in 1803, followed by Great Britain in 1807, and the U.S. in 1808. France is going to join later, Netherlands later, Spain even later. Now, what that means is you can still own slaves. You just can't get any new ones. So we're going to see a lot of families being created from these slaves, and the movement of female and male slaves around the country in order to continue to populate the slave population. Now, we're going to see the emancipation of slaves begins with the British colonies in 1833, then the French, and the U.S. eventually in 1865, and the last major slaveholding country that's eventually going to emancipate their slaves is going to be Brazil. Now, Saudi Arabia and Angola are going to continue African slave trade until the 1960s. So the Arabs were using African slaves before the Atlantic was using them. Now the Atlantic came in, they used more slaves than the Arabs did, but they stopped it, and the Arabs are going to keep using it. All right, guys, not the most cheerful of weeks, But I hope you have a great week. Good luck, and we'll talk to you later.